If you've been trying to fix your life and nothing seems to stick, I need you to hear this clearly. It's not your fault, but that doesn't mean nothing is wrong, because the reason you feel stuck is not the reason you've been told. You've been told to stop playing small, to think bigger, move faster, be more confident, push yourself. But here's the truth no one told you. That advice doesn't work, not for you, not the way you've been trying to use it, because if it did, you wouldn't still feel like this. And you do feel it. That quiet frustration, that internal tension, like you know you're capable of more, but something inside you keeps holding you back. Not loudly, not obviously, but consistently. You start, then you slow down. You get clarity, then you hesitate. You feel momentum, then something shifts, and suddenly you're back where you started, again. And maybe you've blamed yourself. Maybe you've told yourself, I just need more discipline. I need to be more consistent. I need to stop overthinking. But if that were true, you would have fixed this already. Because you're not someone who avoids growth. You think deeply. You reflect. You try. You've spent time trying to understand yourself, and that's exactly why this is so frustrating, because it doesn't make sense. You're doing the work, but the result doesn't match the effort. And this is where most people give you the wrong answer. They tell you to push harder, to override the feeling, to ignore the resistance. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. What if that resistance isn't the problem? What if it's the signal? What if the part of you that keeps slowing you down isn't broken, it's protecting you? You don't say this out loud, but there are moments where you felt it. A quiet knowing that you're meant for something more, not in an arrogant way. Not in a loud, performative way, but in a deep, internal way. Like there's a version of your life that feels more aligned, more honest, more you, and at the same time that version feels distant, almost inaccessible. And that gap, that space between where you are and what you sense is possible, that's where the tension lives. But here's what nobody explains to you. Your mind doesn't respond to potential. It responds to safety. And if the version of you that you're trying to become feels unfamiliar, feels exposed, feels uncertain, your mind will not move you toward it. No matter how motivated you are, no matter how inspired you feel in the moment. Because to your system, unfamiliar equals unsafe. And this is where everything starts to shift. Because now we're not talking about discipline. We're talking about conditioning. You're not inconsistent. You're patterned, and patterns don't change because you want them to. They change when you understand what they're protecting. Yeah. But here's the part most people avoid, because it's easier to stay on the surface. Easier to believe, I just need to try harder. But you already know that doesn't work. So let's go deeper. What if the reason you keep pulling back is because moving forward would require you to become visible in a way you're not ready for? Not just seen by others, but seen clearly. Without hiding, without adjusting, without shrinking parts of yourself to fit. And that sounds empowering until you realize what it actually asks of you. It asks you to let go of the version of yourself that has kept you safe. Think about that. Every behavior you have, every hesitation, every delay has a history. It didn't come from nowhere. At some point, it helped you. It protected you from something. Rejection, judgment, failure, loss. And your system learned, this is how we stay safe. So now, even when you want more, even when you're ready for more, those same patterns activate, not to stop you, but to protect you. And this is why stop playing small is bad advice, because you're not choosing to play small. You're responding to something deeper, something unexamined, something that still feels unresolved. But here's the shift, and this is where it becomes uncomfortable in a different way, because while it's not your fault, it is your responsibility to see it, to understand it, to stop fighting yourself and start listening. You felt this before. That moment where you're about to step into something bigger and something inside you tightens. You hesitate, you question yourself, you suddenly feel unsure. And it feels like doubt, but it's not always doubt. Sometimes it's exposure, and exposure is dangerous to a system that learned to stay hidden. But here's what changes everything. What if the discomfort you feel is not a sign to stop, but a sign that you're getting closer to something real? Not easy, not comfortable, but real. And this is where most people turn back, because growth, real growth, doesn't feel like confidence at first. It feels like uncertainty. It feels like vulnerability. It feels like standing in a space where you don't have full control. And if you've built your identity around being in control, around being prepared, around not making mistakes, then stepping into something bigger feels like losing stability. So you pause, not because you're weak, but because your system is trying to protect stability. But here's the truth you've been avoiding. The life you want does not exist inside the version of you that needs to feel completely safe before acting. And you already know that. You felt it, that tension, that pull. And maybe this is where it becomes something deeper for you, because at some point, This stops being about productivity and starts becoming about purpose. You've had moments where you felt like your life could be more aligned, more intentional, more meaningful, and not in a vague way. In a specific, personal way. Like, there's something you're supposed to step into, something that fits you, but every time you get close, something interrupts it. And what if that interruption isn't random? What if it's the result of misalignment between who you've been conditioned to be and who you were actually created to become? Because when those two don't match, you feel it as tension, as confusion, as hesitation. And you try to fix it with discipline, but discipline doesn't resolve misalignment. It just forces movement in the wrong direction. So you burn out, you start over, you question yourself again, and the cycle continues. But this is the moment where it can change. Not because you push harder, but because you see differently. You stop asking, how do I fix myself? And you start asking, what is this pattern trying to protect me from? And that question changes everything, because now you're not fighting yourself, you're understanding yourself, and understanding creates space. Space to choose differently, space to respond differently, space to move forward without forcing. But this is only the first layer, because once you start seeing your patterns, once you start recognizing what's been driving your decisions, you begin to notice something else, something deeper. There's a difference between being safe and being aligned. And for most of your life, you've been choosing safety, not consciously, but consistently. And now you're at a point where that choice no longer works because you've outgrown it. But outgrowing something doesn't mean it automatically releases you. You have to see it. You have to name it. You have to understand it. And most importantly, you have to decide if you're ready to let it go. Not all at once, not perfectly, but intentionally.
Because the version of you that you're becoming requires something different. And this is where it gets real, because stepping into that version means letting go of the comfort of being hidden. And that's not easy, but neither is staying where you are.
And you feel that quiet frustration, that internal pressure. That's not failure, that's awareness. And awareness is where everything begins. But this is only the beginning, because what you've been calling playing small was never the real problem. It was the symptom, a signal, a response to something deeper that you hadn't fully seen yet. And now you're starting to see it. Not all of it, but enough to feel the shift. Enough to realize this isn't about fixing yourself, it's about understanding what's been quietly running your life. But here's where this gets more real, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And that's where most people get stuck in a different way. Not in confusion, but in awareness without movement. They see what's been holding them back, but they don't understand why it still has power over them. And that's the next layer. The one almost no one talks about, the hidden fear that sits underneath your patterns. The one that doesn't just slow you down, it pulls you back, right? At the moment things start to work, you've felt that too. That moment where things begin to align, and something inside you tightens, not at the beginning, but right before the breakthrough. That's not coincidence, and it's not weakness. It's something much more specific, much more personal. And until you see it clearly, you'll keep repeating the same cycle, just at higher levels. So if this felt familiar, if something in you recognized yourself in this, then what comes next is the part that explains everything you couldn't name before. Because the real question isn't, why am I playing small? It's, what am I actually afraid will happen if I stop? And that answer changes everything. But that's a deeper conversation. And if this is already hitting something real for you, make sure you're subscribed, because this is just the surface of what we're going to uncover. Let's go deeper, because what you're dealing with didn't start today. It didn't start when you lost motivation. It didn't start when you procrastinated. It didn't even start when you began doubting yourself. This goes further back, further than you usually let yourself think. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because if you really look at your life, you'll start to notice something. You don't just hesitate randomly. You hesitate in specific moments, predictable moments. Moments where something is about to change. You don't stop at the beginning. You stop when it starts to become real. You felt that. You get the idea. You feel inspired. You even take action. And for a moment, it feels different. Like this time might actually work. And then something shifts. Subtle but powerful. You slow down. You overthink. You question what you were just confident about. You start noticing flaws that weren't there before, and before you even realize what's happening, you've pulled back, not completely, just enough to stay where you are. And this is the part that frustrates you, because it doesn't feel logical. It feels like you're getting in your own way, like you're sabotaging yourself. But what if you're not? What if what you call self-sabotage is actually self-protection? Stay with that, Because this changes everything. Your mind is not designed to make you successful. It's designed to keep you safe. And safety is not the same as growth. So every time you move towards something unfamiliar, something bigger, something that requires you to be seen differently, your system asks one question: is this safe? And if the answer is unclear, it doesn't move you forward. It pulls you back, not to hurt you, to protect you. But here's the part most people never realize. Your definition of safe wasn't created today. It was built over time, through experiences, moments, situations where you learned, consciously or unconsciously, this is what I need to do to be okay. Maybe it was a moment where you spoke up and were dismissed, so you learned, stay quiet, it's safer. Maybe you tried something bold and it didn't work, so you learned, don't risk too much, stay controlled. Maybe you were seen but not fully accepted, so you learned, only show certain parts of yourself. And over time, those moments didn't just stay memories. They became patterns, automatic responses, default behaviors, invisible rules. Rules like, don't be too much, don't stand out too early, don't move unless you're sure, don't let people see you fail. And the problem is, you don't consciously think these thoughts anymore, you just live them. They show up as hesitation, as overthinking, as perfectionism, as starting and not finishing. And from the outside, it looks like inconsistency, but from the inside, it's protection. You felt this in small ways. You open your laptop, you're ready to work, you know what you need to do, and then something shifts. You check something else first. You reorganize, you tweak, you delay just a little, and you tell yourself, I'm just not in the right mindset yet. But if you're honest, that's not what's happening. Something in you decided, this doesn't feel safe to fully step into yet. And instead of moving forward, you adjust it. That's the pattern, and the reason it's so powerful is because it feels like you. It doesn't feel like something external. It feels like your personality, your preferences, your way of doing things. I'm just someone who overthinks. I'm just someone who needs more time. I'm just someone who struggles with consistency. But those aren't identities. They're adaptations, responses to something your system is still trying to protect you from. And until you see that, you'll keep trying to fix the wrong problem. You'll try to be more disciplined, more structured, more productive. But discipline doesn't override protection. You can force yourself forward for a while, but eventually the pattern pulls you back. Because it's not random, it's programmed. But here's where it gets even deeper. Because not all protection patterns are obvious. Some of them feel positive. You stay prepared, you think things through. You don't rush into things, and those can be strengths, but sometimes they're also shields. Because if you're always preparing, you never have to fully step in. If you're always refining, you never have to fully release. If you're always thinking, you never have to fully risk. And that's where the pattern hides. Not in failure, but in delay. Not in quitting, but in holding back just enough. And this is why it's so hard to catch. Because it doesn't look like self-sabotage. It looks responsible. It looks thoughtful. It looks like you're doing things the right way. But deep down you feel it. That quiet tension, like you're close to something, but not fully in it. Like you're moving, but not really progressing. And that feeling is not something to ignore. It's information, because it's showing you where your protection pattern is still active. And once you see that, you start to realize something important. You've never actually been stuck. You've been regulated, kept within a range that feels safe to your system, not too exposed, not too visible, not too far outside what you already know. And anything beyond that range triggers resistance. Not because you can't handle it, but because your system hasn't learned that it's safe yet. And that's the shift. You stop asking, why can't I move forward? And you start asking, what part of me believes this isn't safe yet? Because that part is running the pattern. And here's the truth that might change how you see yourself completely. That part of you is not your enemy. It's a younger version of you, a past version, a version that learned something important at the time and is still trying to apply it now. Even though your life has changed, even though you've grown, it's still operating from an old rule. And until you update that rule, the pattern stays. But awareness is where that update begins. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you create distance from it. And that distance gives you choice, not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. You start noticing it in real time, that moment where you're about to pull back. And instead of automatically following it, you pause. You don't force yourself forward. You don't fight yourself. You just recognize, this is protection, and that recognition alone starts to loosen its grip. But here's the part most people don't expect. The pattern doesn't disappear just because you understand it. In fact, sometimes it gets louder because now you're getting closer to moving beyond it. And that's where things start to feel even more uncomfortable because you're no longer unaware. You see what's happening. You feel it in real time. And now the question becomes, what do you do next? Do you go back to what feels safe? Or do you start stepping into something your system isn't fully comfortable with yet? And this is where the real shift begins, because understanding the pattern is only the first step. The next step is learning how to move with it without letting it control you. And that's where most people get stuck again. Not because they don't see it, but because they don't understand what's actually underneath it. Because every protection pattern is rooted in something deeper, a fear, a belief, a meaning your mind created at some point. And until you uncover that, you're only working at the surface. So now the question changes again. Not, what am I doing wrong? But what am I trying to avoid feeling? Because that feeling is the key to everything. And once you start to see it clearly, you'll understand why you've been pulling back right at the moment things start to become real. And that's exactly where we're going next. Now that you've seen the pattern, we need to talk about what it actually does. Because patterns don't just exist. They run cycles. And if you've been feeling like your life is repeating itself, this is why. You don't just struggle randomly, you move in loops, invisible loops. And the reason they're so powerful is because they don't feel like loops when you're inside them. They feel like effort, like trying, like progress almost. But if you step back, you'll start to notice something. A sequence. It starts the same way almost every time. With a moment of clarity, you see something differently, you feel motivated, something clicks, you tell yourself, this time is different, and you mean it because in that moment it feels true. So you begin, you take action, maybe small at first, maybe bigger than usual, and for a while, you're moving. This is the part where most people think, finally, I'm getting somewhere. But this is also where the loop quietly begins, because as you move forward, you start approaching something specific. Not the goal itself, but what comes with it. Visibility, exposure, change. And this is where your system starts paying attention. At first, it's subtle. You feel a slight hesitation, a small resistance. Nothing dramatic, just enough to slow you down a little. You tell yourself, I just need to think this through more. So you pause, and that pause feels reasonable, responsible, even. But then it grows. You start questioning things you were clear about. You start adjusting things that were already working. You begin to overanalyze. And what used to feel simple now feels complicated. What used to feel exciting now feels heavy. And without realizing it, you've shifted from movement to management, managing your thoughts, managing your emotions, managing the risk. And this is where most people don't recognize what's happening. Because from the outside, it still looks like you're engaged. You're still thinking about it, still planning, still working on it. But internally, you've already pulled back. You're no longer stepping forward, you're stabilizing. And eventually that stabilization turns into delay. I'll do it tomorrow. I just need more clarity. I'm not fully ready yet. And those reasons feel valid. That's what makes the loop so dangerous. It doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels justified. But if you're honest, you've seen this before. You've felt that moment where you knew you were close to something real, and then suddenly you weren't moving the same way anymore. Not because you didn't care, but because something inside you changed the direction. And eventually, you stop. Not always completely, but enough. Enough to lose momentum. Enough to disconnect from the version of you that was moving forward. And then comes the part that hurts the most. You look back, and you realize you didn't follow through. Again. And this is where most people become hard on themselves. They say, why do I always do this? Why can't I stay consistent? What's wrong with me? But now you see it differently. It's not random, it's a loop. And every loop has a structure. So let's make it clear. This is what's been happening. You feel inspired, you take action, you approach exposure, your system detects risk. You hesitate, you overthink, you delay, you disconnect, then later you reset and the cycle begins again. Different situation, same pattern. And this is why it feels like you're trying, but not progressing. Because you're moving, but not completing. You're starting, but not arriving. And over time, this creates something deeper, not just frustration. Doubt, not doubt in your goals, doubt in yourself. Because every time the loop completes, it reinforces a belief. I don't follow through. I can't trust myself. I always fall back. And that belief makes the next loop even stronger. Because now you're not just dealing with the pattern, you're dealing with the identity it created. And this is where it becomes heavy, because now it feels personal. Like this is just who you are, but it's not. It's what you've been repeating. And repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity feels like identity. But it's not the truth, it's conditioning. And this is where the shift begins. Because once you can see the loop clearly, you can interrupt it. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And interruption is what breaks repetition. But before you can interrupt it, you have to catch it, not after it's over. In the moment it starts, and that moment is earlier than you think. It's not when you stop, it's when you hesitate. That small pause, that slight pullback, that moment where something feels off, and you start to think instead of move. That's the entry point. That's where the loop begins to take control. And if you miss that moment, the rest happens automatically. But if you catch it, everything changes, because now you have a choice. Not an easy choice, but a real one. You can follow the pattern, or you can do something different. And doing something different doesn't mean forcing yourself. It means recognizing what's happening and choosing to stay present instead of escaping into delay. Even if it's uncomfortable, especially if it's uncomfortable. Because that discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're stepping outside the loop. And that's where growth actually begins. But here's the part most people don't expect. Even when you break the loop, even when you move forward, that doesn't mean the feeling disappears. The hesitation might still be there, the discomfort might still show up, because the pattern doesn't vanish instantly. It loses power gradually, through awareness, through repetition of new choices, through proving to your system that what once felt unsafe is actually something you can handle. And that takes time, but it starts with one moment, one interruption, one decision to not go back to what's familiar. And if you've been listening closely, you're already starting to see it, not just as an idea, but in your own life. Moments where the loop showed up. Moments where you pulled back, moments where you almost stepped into something more and didn't. And this isn't to make you feel regret, it's to show you something powerful. You were never incapable. You were repeating a cycle you didn't fully understand. But now you're starting to understand it. And that changes what's possible for you. Because the moment you can see the loop, you are no longer fully controlled by it. But there's still something deeper underneath this. Because the loop itself is not the root, it's the expression. The real question is, why does your system react this way, right before things become real? Why that moment? Why that point? Because it's not random, it's specific. And until you understand what's underneath that reaction, the loop will keep trying to pull you back, even if you break it temporarily. So now we go deeper, not into the pattern, but into what's driving it. Because what you're afraid of is not what you've been telling yourself. And once you see it clearly, you won't just interrupt the loop. You'll start to understand why it ever existed in the first place. And that's where everything truly begins to change. We've talked about the pattern. We've broken down the loop. You've started to see how it shows up in your life. But now we need to go underneath all of it. Because patterns don't exist on their own. Loops don't run without a reason. There is something driving this. Something deeper. Something more specific than fear of failure. And this is where most people stop. Because fear of failure sounds right. It feels familiar. But if that were the real issue, you wouldn't get as far as you do. You wouldn't start. You wouldn't try. You wouldn't move forward at all. But you do. You begin, you take steps, you get close. And then you pull back. So this isn't about starting, and it's not just about failing. It's about something that shows up right before things become real. And if you've been listening closely, you felt that moment. That exact point where everything starts to shift. Not at the beginning, but right before the breakthrough. That moment where things are working, you're being seen, there's momentum, and suddenly, something inside you tightens, you hesitate, you slow down, you question everything, and it feels like fear, but not the kind you've been told about, because this isn't fear of trying, this is fear of what happens if it actually works. Stay with that, because this is the part almost no one talks about. What you're afraid of is not just failure, it's exposure, it's being seen clearly, not partially, not controlled, but fully. And being seen fully means you can no longer hide behind potential. You can no longer say, I could do more if I wanted to. Because now you're doing it. And that changes something, because potential is safe. Potential doesn't require proof. It doesn't require consistency. It doesn't require you to hold a new level, but reality does. And stepping into reality means stepping into responsibility. Responsibility to show up. Responsibility to be consistent, responsibility to maintain what you've created. And if you've never seen yourself as someone who can hold that, that feels heavy. So your system pulls you back. Not because you're incapable, but because you're not yet convinced that you can sustain it. And that's one layer, but there's another, a deeper one. Because for some of you, it's not just about being seen. It's about what being seen might cost you. Relationships, expectations, perceptions. What happens if you change and the people around you don't respond the same way? What happens if you grow and it creates distance? What happens if you succeed and it makes others uncomfortable? You don't always think these thoughts consciously, but your system feels them. And it asks, is this worth the risk? And if that answer is unclear, it slows you down. But here's where it gets even more personal. Because underneath all of this, there's something even quieter. Something you don't say out loud. The fear of losing the version of yourself you've known for so long. Because even if that version has kept you small, it's also kept you familiar. You know how to be that version. You know how to operate there. There's a strange kind of comfort in it. And stepping beyond it means becoming someone you don't fully recognize yet, and that can feel like losing control. So you stay in between. Not fully where you were, not fully where you're going. Just enough movement to feel like you're trying, but enough hesitation to stay safe. And that in-between space is where most people live. But you started to see it now. You felt it. That tension, that pull. And this is where the truth becomes unavoidable. You're not just afraid of failing, you're afraid of what your life will require of you if you stop holding yourself back. Because success alignment, stepping into your calling, comes with weight. Not negative weight, but responsibility, visibility, consistency. And if you've never fully trusted yourself in those areas, your system hesitates. But here's the shift, and this is where it becomes healing. The fear you feel is not proof that you shouldn't move forward. It's proof that you're approaching something that matters, something real. Because your system doesn't react this strongly to things that don't matter. It reacts to significance, to change, to moments that will redefine how you see yourself. And that's exactly where you've been stopping, right before that redefinition happens, but now you're aware of it. And awareness changes your relationship with fear, because now, when you feel that tightening, that hesitation, that pullback, you don't immediately interpret it as, something is wrong. You start to see it as, something is shifting, and that shift is where your next level actually begins. But here's what you need to understand. You don't eliminate this fear. You don't wait for it to disappear. Because if you do, you'll stay in the same place. Instead, you learn to move with it, not recklessly, but intentionally. You acknowledge it, you understand it, and then you choose not to let it make the decision for you, even if that means moving forward while feeling uncertain, because certainty is not what creates transformation. Alignment is, and sometimes alignment feels uncomfortable at first, not because it's wrong, but because it's new. And your system is still learning how to hold it. But this is where something deeper begins to unfold, because once you start moving through this fear, once you stop letting it automatically pull you back, you begin to experience something different, not just progress, expansion, a sense that you're stepping into something that was always there, but you weren't fully accessing. And for some of you, this is where it becomes more than psychological. It becomes spiritual, because you start to feel like your life has a direction, not one you forced, but one that fits, one that feels aligned with who you actually are. And that feeling is not random, but stepping into that requires something from you, not perfection, but willingness to be seen, willingness to grow, willingness to move even when it's uncomfortable. And that's where most people pause again. Not because they don't want it, but because they don't yet trust themselves with it. And that's what we need to change next. Because understanding your fear is not the end. It's the doorway. The real shift happens when you learn how to respond differently to it. Not just once, but consistently. And that's what allows you to move out of the loop, not temporarily, but permanently. So now the question becomes, how do you actually do that? How do you stop letting this pattern, this fear, this automatic pullback control your decisions? Because awareness showed you the truth, but action is what will change your life. And that's where we're going next. Because this is the point where most people understand, but don't transform. And you're not here to stay the same with more awareness. You're here to move differently. And that requires a new way of responding in the exact moments that used to hold you back. That's the next step. If you're still here, it means something in this is speaking directly to you. And there's a lot more depth like this coming, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Now you see it. The pattern, the loop, the fear underneath it. You felt it in your own life, not as a concept, but as something real, something that's been shaping your decisions. And that awareness is powerful, but awareness alone doesn't change your life. Because if it did, you would have changed already. You've been aware before, aware that you overthink, aware that you hesitate, aware that you hold back. But awareness without direction turns into frustration. So now we shift, not into forcing yourself, but into responding differently. Because the goal is not to eliminate the pattern, it's to stop letting it control you, and that starts with something simple. But not easy. You have to catch it. Not after. Not when the day is over. Not when you're reflecting. In the moment. That moment where something shifts. You felt it. You're moving forward, and then suddenly you pause. You hesitate. That is the moment. That is where everything begins. Because before that moment, you're in control. After that moment, the pattern takes over. So the first shift is this. You don't ignore the hesitation. You recognize it. You don't say, I need to push through this. You say, this is the pattern. And that alone changes your position, because now you're not inside it. You're observing it, and observation creates space, and space creates choice. But here's where most people make a mistake. They try to replace the pattern with force. They say, I just need to discipline myself. I just need to stop overthinking. I just need to be better. But force triggers more resistance, because your system still thinks it's protecting you. So instead, you shift how you respond, not by fighting the pattern, but by interrupting it. An interruption doesn't have to be big. It just has to be intentional. So when that hesitation shows up, instead of stepping back, you stay, not perfectly, not confidently, but consciously. You don't leave the moment. You don't escape into distraction. You stay present with the discomfort, even for a few seconds longer than you usually would. And that might not seem like much, but that's how patterns begin to break. Not through massive action, through small interruptions, repeated consistently, because every time you stay, instead of pulling back, you teach your system something new. This is safe enough, not completely safe, but safe enough to continue, and that's all you need. You don't need full confidence. You don't need certainty. You need willingness. Willingness to take one step without escaping, and then another, and this is where the pattern begins to weaken. Not because it disappears, but because it's no longer automatic, but we go deeper. Because interruption alone is not enough, you also have to change the meaning. Because right now your system is interpreting discomfort as danger. So every time you feel that tension, it signals, stop. But what if that interpretation is wrong? What if that discomfort is not danger, but growth? Not something to avoid, but something to move through. So instead of saying, this doesn't feel right, you begin to say, this feels unfamiliar. And that shift matters because unfamiliar is not unsafe, it's just new, and your system doesn't know the difference yet. So you teach it by staying, by moving forward in small ways, by not abandoning yourself in that moment. And this is where something powerful happens. You start to build trust, not in the outcome, in yourself. Because every time you stay present, every time you move forward without escaping, you prove something. I can handle this. And that belief is what you've been missing. Not motivation, not discipline, trust that you won't disappear when things get uncomfortable, trust that you won't abandon yourself when it gets real. And once that trust begins to build, everything starts to change, because now you don't need to force consistency. You become consistent, not perfectly, but progressively. And this still hesitate, still delay. And this is where the old version of you would spiral, would judge yourself, would say, I'm back at the beginning, but now you see it differently. You don't collapse, you reflect, not with criticism, with awareness. What happened? Where did I leave the moment? And that reflection keeps you moving forward, because progress is not about never falling back. It's about returning faster, with more awareness, with more intention, and over time those returns become quicker. The hesitation becomes shorter, the pattern loses strength, and you begin to experience something new. Momentum, not forced momentum, natural movement. And that's when things start to feel different. Not because everything is easy, but because you're no longer stuck in the same loop. You're moving through it. And this is where the transformation becomes real, because you're not just understanding yourself anymore, you're changing how you show up in real situations. And that is what creates a different life. But there's still one more shift, because even as you begin to move differently, there's a deeper question underneath all of this. Not just how do I change, but what am I actually moving toward? Because breaking the pattern is not the final goal. It's the beginning of alignment, the beginning of stepping into something that actually fits you. And that's where we go next. Because once you stop living from protection, you have to learn how to live from alignment. That changes everything. Up until now, you've been living in a system built around safety, not consciously, but consistently. Every decision, every hesitation, every delay has been filtered through one question. Does this feel safe? And for a long time, that worked. It protected you. It helped you avoid things you weren't ready for. It gave you stability. But there comes a point where what once protected you starts to limit you. And if you've been feeling that tension lately, that quiet frustration, that sense that something isn't fully right, this is why, because there's a difference between being safe and being aligned. And most people live their entire lives choosing safety, not because they don't want more, but because safety feels predictable, controlled, familiar. But alignment feels different. Alignment doesn't always feel safe at first. It feels honest. And honesty can be uncomfortable, because alignment requires you to see yourself clearly, not just who you've been, but who you actually are underneath all of that. And those two don't always match. You felt this before. Moments where something in your life looked right but didn't feel right. Moments where you were doing what made sense, but something inside you felt disconnected. That's misalignment, and misalignment doesn't always show up as something obvious. Sometimes it shows up as confusion, as overthinking, as lack of clarity, as starting things and not feeling fully connected to them. And when that happens, you try to fix it with discipline. You try to push through, but discipline cannot create alignment. It can only force movement, and forced movement eventually leads to burnout because you're moving but not in the direction that actually fits you. And that's exhausting. But here's the truth most people avoid. You already feel what's aligned, not perfectly, but enough. There are things that feel different to you, ideas that don't leave your mind, directions that keep coming back, paths that feel right, even if they don't feel easy, even if they don't feel safe. And at the same time, those are the very things you hesitate on the most, because alignment requires you to let go of safety, not completely, but enough. Enough to step into something unfamiliar, enough to trust something you can't fully control yet. And that's where most people pause. Not because they don't see it, but because they don't trust it. They don't trust themselves, and they don't trust what they feel. So they go back to what's safe, even if it doesn't feel right. But you can only do that for so long, because misalignment creates pressure, internal pressure, a sense that you're not fully living the life you're capable of, and that pressure doesn't go away by ignoring it. It grows until you either respond to it or you settle into it. And if you've been listening to this, you're not someone who wants to settle. You feel that sense that there's more, not in a vague way, in a real way, a personal way, like there's something specific you're meant to step into. And this is where it becomes deeper, because for some of you, this isn't just about growth. It's about calling, and calling doesn't always feel comfortable. It feels right and uncomfortable at the same time, because it asks more from you. More honesty, more visibility, more responsibility. And if you've spent most of your life operating from safety, that feels like a lot, so you hesitate. Not because it's wrong, but because it's different. But here's what you need to understand. What feels aligned will often feel uncomfortable at first, not because it's not meant for you, but because you haven't lived there yet. Your system doesn't recognize it as familiar, so it labels it as unsafe. And this is where you have to make a different decision, not based on what feels comfortable, but based on what feels true. And those are not always the same thing. Comfort says, stay where you understand everything. Alignment says, step into what feels right, even if you don't fully understand it yet. And that requires trust, not in the outcome, in yourself. Trust that you can grow into what you're stepping into. Trust that you don't need to have it all figured out before you begin. Trust that clarity comes from movement, not from waiting. And this is where something shifts internally, because now you're not trying to eliminate fear. You're choosing direction, and direction gives your movement meaning. So instead of asking, does this feel safe? You begin to ask, does this feel aligned? And that question changes everything, because now you're not just avoiding discomfort, you're moving toward truth, even if it's uncomfortable. And that's where growth becomes different. Not forced, but intentional, not driven by pressure, but by clarity. And this is where your life starts to shift in a deeper way, because you're no longer reacting to your patterns, you're choosing your direction. And that choice is what begins to break everything that used to hold you back. But here's the part most people don't expect. Choosing alignment doesn't make everything easier, it makes everything clearer. And clarity means you can no longer ignore what you feel. You can no longer pretend you don't know. And that's where your next level begins. Because now you're not just aware of your patterns, you're aware of your direction, and that awareness requires a response. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, but soon. Because once you see what's aligned, staying where you are becomes harder than moving forward, and that's the moment everything starts to change. But now the question becomes, how do you actually step into that version of yourself consistently? Not just once, not just when you feel motivated, but in a way that becomes your new normal, because seeing alignment is one thing, becoming it is something else entirely. And that's where we go next. At this point, you've seen too much to go back. You've seen the pattern, you've understood the loop, you've recognized the fear, and now you've felt the difference between safety and alignment. So the question is no longer, why am I stuck? The question is, am I ready to become someone different? Because that's what this really is. Not a productivity problem, an identity shift. And identity is not something you change overnight. It's something you step into gradually, intentionally, and sometimes uncomfortably, because the version of you that you're becoming doesn't think the same way, doesn't respond the same way, doesn't pull back in the same moments. And that means you can't rely on your old patterns anymore. You have to make new decisions, not big, dramatic ones, small, consistent ones, in the exact moments that used to define your behavior. That moment where you would normally hesitate, you choose to stay. That moment where you would normally overthink, you choose to act. That moment where you would normally pull back, you choose to move forward just a little more. And at first, that feels unnatural, because you're not used to it. It doesn't feel like you yet, but that's the point, because the version of you that feels familiar is the one that's been shaped by the pattern. And the version of you that feels unfamiliar is the one you're growing into. So instead of asking, why does this feel uncomfortable? You start asking, is this who I'm becoming? And that shift matters, because now you're not trying to stay the same. You're allowing yourself to evolve. But here's where most people get stuck again. They try to jump into their next level all at once. They say, I'm going to be consistent now. I'm going to show up differently starting today. I'm going to change everything. And for a moment it works. But then it collapses, because identity doesn't change through intensity. It changes through repetition, through small, consistent proof. So instead of trying to become your next version overnight, you start practicing it. You practice showing up. You practice staying present. You practice moving forward in moments that used to stop you. And every time you do that, you send a signal to your system. This is who we are now. Not perfectly, but progressively. And that's how identity begins to shift. Not through declarations, through decisions, repeated decisions, but there's something else you need to understand. Stepping into your next version is not just about what you do. It's about what you let go of. Because you cannot carry your old identity into a new level of your life. You can't keep the same patterns, the same hesitations, the same way of thinking, and expect a different result. So part of this process is release. Letting go of the version of you that needed to stay small to feel safe. Letting go of the version of you that waited for certainty before acting. Letting go of the version of you that questioned yourself in every critical moment. And that's not always easy, because even if that version limited you, it was familiar. And letting go of familiarity can feel like losing control. But what you're actually doing is making space. Space for something more aligned, more honest, more powerful. And you don't do this all at once. You do it in moments, moment by moment, choice by choice. And over time, those choices become your new normal. You start to notice something different. You don't hesitate the same way. You don't pull back as quickly. You don't overthink as long. And the things that used to feel overwhelming start to feel manageable. Not easy, but possible. And that's where confidence actually comes from. Not from thinking you can do everything perfectly, but from experiencing yourself handling things you used to avoid. That's real confidence. And once you start building that, everything changes, because now you're not waiting to feel ready. You're becoming someone who moves anyway. And that's the difference between staying where you are and stepping into something new. But here's the truth you need to hold on to. This process is not linear. There will be moments where you fall back. Moments where the pattern shows up again. Moments where you hesitate. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you're still in the process. And the difference now is that you don't stay there. You recognize it faster. You return faster. You move forward again with more awareness. And that's growth. Not perfection, progress. And if you stay with this, if you continue to show up in those moments, you will become someone different, not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. And that version of you is not something you have to chase. It's something you're already stepping into right now. But there's one more layer to this, because stepping into your next version is not just about changing your behavior. It's about understanding what your life actually requires of you now. Because once you stop playing small, once you stop holding yourself back, your life expands, and expansion comes with responsibility, not pressure, but expectation to show up, to stay aligned, to not shrink back into old patterns when things get real. And that's where the real test begins, not in understanding, but in consistency. And that's what determines whether this becomes a moment or a transformation. So now the question is no longer, can I change? You already are. The question is, will I continue? Because what you do next determines everything. And this is where most people either step fully into their life or slowly drift back into what's familiar. But if you've made it this far, you're not here to drift back. You're here to move forward. And what that looks like What that truly requires from you is something we need to look at clearly, because this is where everything either comes together or falls back into the same cycle. And that's what we're about to uncover. At this point, you're not the same person who started listening. Not because everything in your life has changed yet, but because you've seen something. You've seen the pattern, you've understood the loop, you've recognized the fear. And more importantly, you've realized something that shifts everything. You were never the problem. You were responding to something you didn't fully understand, and now you do, not perfectly, but enough to see yourself differently, and that matters more than you think, because the way you see yourself determines the way you move, and the way you move determines the life you create. So now the question is no longer, why am I like this? That question doesn't serve you anymore. The new question is, what do I do with what I now know? Because awareness creates responsibility, not pressure, but responsibility. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you now understand. And that means you have a choice, not a loud, dramatic choice, a quiet one, the kind that shows up in moments, the moment you feel hesitation, the moment you start to overthink, the moment where you would normally pull back. That's where your new life begins. Not in big decisions, in small, honest ones. And this is where most people misunderstand transformation. They think it happens in breakthroughs, in big moments. But real transformation happens in the decisions nobody sees, the moments where you choose to stay instead of escape, to act instead of delay, to trust instead of retreat. And those moments build something, not instantly, but steadily. They build a new version of you, a version that doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable, a version that doesn't abandon herself when it gets real, a version that stays. And staying is what changes everything. But here's the truth you need to hold on to. This process is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming present. Because perfection will always keep you waiting, but presence moves you forward. Even when you're unsure, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you don't have all the answers. And that's where your power actually is. Not in having everything figured out, but in continuing anyway. And if you do that, if you keep showing up in those small moments, your life will begin to shift. Not all at once, but in ways you can feel. You'll notice it in how you respond. You'll notice it in how quickly you recover. You'll notice it in how you stop abandoning yourself. And eventually, you'll notice something else. The things that once felt heavy start to feel natural. The things that once stopped you no longer hold the same power. And the version of you that once felt distant becomes who you are. Not because you forced it, but because you grew into it. And that's the real transformation. Not becoming someone else, but becoming who you were always meant to be, without the patterns that were holding you back. But before you move on, there's something important you need to understand. This isn't the end. Not in a there's more content way, in a real way, because what you've just uncovered is only the first layer of something deeper. You've seen the pattern, but there's still a question underneath it. A quiet one that doesn't always show up immediately, but once it does, you won't be able to ignore it. And it's this. What happens when you finally stop holding yourself back and your life actually begins to change? Not in theory, in reality, when things start working, when opportunities open, when your life begins to expand, because that moment, the moment things begin to shift, comes with something most people aren't prepared for, not fear. Something deeper, something that determines whether you step fully into your life or slowly pull yourself back into what's familiar. And if you've ever experienced progress and then somehow found yourself back in the same place again, you've already felt it, but you haven't fully seen it yet. And that's where your next level actually begins. Because understanding why you've been stuck is one thing, but understanding why you sometimes return to it, even when things are going well, that changes everything. So as you leave this, don't rush. Don't try to change everything at once. Just notice your patterns, notice your responses, notice those small moments where you now have a choice, and choose differently, even if it's just a little, because those small shifts are what create a completely different life. And if something in you felt seen in this, if something in you recognized yourself in these words, then you're already closer than you think, not to perfection, but to truth. And truth is where everything begins. But there's still something we haven't fully uncovered yet. Because the real shift doesn't just happen when you break the pattern, it happens when you learn how to hold what comes after. And that is a different kind of conversation. And if this gave you something you've been trying to understand for a long time, don't let this be the only time you hear something like this. There's a deeper level to this kind of growth, and we're going to keep exploring it. So if you haven't already, subscribe and stay close to this. Because the next layer of this is something most people never fully understand. Pay attention to what shows up next.